After just over a decade, the Google Assistant is reaching its end-of-life phase, but what does that mean for the millions of us that have used it for so long, and what are the next steps for the next platform? Well, let's get into it in this video. If you love the Google Assistant like we do, then how about you do me a favour and hit that subscribe button to get all the details on everything in the Google ecosystem like this. Cheers. So you may be aware that the Google Assistant began life on the Google Home and the Pixel, and it has basically come to every single product you've probably used or has been unveiled by Google since 2016. In all honesty though, it hasn't changed all that much really since it was revealed at I/O way back when. So at its core, you just use your voice to get updates, information and control smart home hardware. That is the basis of what was possible with Google Assistant. Specific commands were needed and the classic Google wake word, trust me, I'm not going to say this and ruin your day for you. It surpassed Siri, it went toe to toe with Alexa, and it's become a household staple for millions of people around the globe. In its simplest form, the Google Assistant just does what it's set out to, and I think that's absolutely fine. However, I do think the simplicity was kind of almost always been its ceiling. While we're satisfied with a tool that can do things like set timers, play your favourite playlists on Spotify or YouTube Music, the underlying architecture was built on a rigid if this, then that kind of logic. It didn't necessarily understand the world, it just understood a very specific library of verbs and nouns and sometimes precursors that you put in there like times, that kind of thing. For years, it has been the gold standard of what voice interaction was, but the industry has pivoted towards large language models over the past 3 or 4 years. They're LLMs to me and you, and the assistant's deterministic nature has started to look like a bit of a relic of a bygone era. You could say that in many ways, the peak of the assistant's utility was the beginning in some ways of its obsolescence in the long term. And as good as the Google Assistant can be at its best, there has been a steady decline in lots of ways and in terms of functionality. Some key, some slightly less important. No new functions have been added in a couple of years. There's a good reason for that. And at the start of 2024, Google actually axed 18 features, from doing things like being able to manage your cookbooks to rescheduling Google Calendar events, all using your voice. By the time the transition hit its peak in March 2026, another wave of underutilized features were stripped away from this. The assistant that we have today, it's starting to become a skeleton of its former self. We've lost the intuitive multimedia controls that once allowed us to favourite or share photos and query locations by voice. Voice commands for photo frame and screen settings have just vanished. Even high-value utilities like interpreter mode and family bell have been gutted or relegated to cumbersome manual routines that you have to set. On the road, the voice-first assistant driving mode has been sunset recently, leaving drivers with a stripped-back Google Maps view. In the living room, the shutdown of Assistant on LG WebOS TVs, although it's not strictly first-party hardware, has turned former selling points into a cross-brand legacy or a relic of a cross-brand legacy. Perhaps most tellingly, Google has pulled Assistant from Fitbit wearables like the Sense and the Versa lineup. Despite owning the brand, Google is kind of forcing a choice. Move to a Pixel Watch or lose that wrist-based voice utility that you may use day to day. This feature gutting has created a bit of a trust deficit for lots of people, and understandably so. For many, the smart home was a promise of reliability, yet the removal of lots of these features feels like, to put it mildly, a breach of contract. When you went back in the day and purchased a smart display specifically for its photo frame capabilities or a watch for its hand-free utility, having those features revoked via a server-side update is a really bitter pill to swallow. And it points to a broader trend in the industry where hardware is no longer necessarily a static purchase, but kind of a window into a service that can be altered or diminished, kind of at the whim of the provider or the person you've bought it from. The digital decay we're starting to witness isn't just about losing the ability to check a photo's location though, it's about the erosion of some of the utility-first philosophy that I think made Google's ecosystem feel somewhat indispensable over the other options like Siri and Alexa. Google has even a dedicated support page cataloguing the removal of functionality from the assistant. At least at the time of this video going live, the company does offer alternatives and workarounds for those. But the trajectory is clear. Google is burning bridges to the assistant to kind of force or justify a migration towards Gemini, and this exposes that fundamental shift in philosophy. The assistant was built to microtask, do one thing instantly or reliably, while the Gemini option probably is going to open up lots of other features that weren't necessarily ever going to be possible with the assistant. Last year, Google did confirm that from March 2026, the assistant will no longer be an option on Android devices in favour of Gemini. So if you buy a phone today or a tablet today, it won't actually be able to fall back to the Google Assistant like some older models. The transition for existing phones hasn't been instant. Instead, it's been removed bit by bit. So it's not necessarily as painful as a straight up rip off the band-aid kind of process. Phones, I think, are where this is going to be the most apparent where this transition is. It's not necessarily the only place where the assistant is being ditched, but there are other areas where we might start to see pain points. Chromebooks, for instance, which are another bigger area of contention for Google right now, beyond just assistant functionality, have lost the ability to use this tool. Gemini is now the default on Chromebooks. Then again, I have to say we're not necessarily sure this is much of an issue, as it would maybe be on mobile and phones and tablets. The Chrome OS 134 update actually started to transition over to Gemini, and on the Chromebook Plus, you do actually get more features that are part of this change, more tools that take advantage of Gemini, which I think is good for laptop owners, but what the future holds for the platform itself, Chrome OS, does remain to be seen anyway. The loss of the assistant on Chromebooks, though, does highlight a strategic pivot towards productivity over simple assistants. So on a laptop, Google wants you to use AI to do things like draft emails, summarize documents, and generate code if you're a coder. Tasks that the old assistant just simply would never ever be able to handle. But for the user who just wanted to say the Google wake word and then turn on office lights, I do think it might not necessarily be the most intuitive experience. The new Gemini overlay can feel somewhat heavy-handed if you do want to do those. So yeah, there are problem areas with this transition on other hardware. Android Auto has also started recently rolling out Gemini a little bit more widely across the globe. This transition isn't without its own issues too, but it feels more like the perfect place to start with a more pliable voice controller at the heart of your vehicle. Android Automotive should be similarly getting this update in the coming months, but so far it isn't privy to that same level of support as the mobile phone-based or powered system in your car. The stakes are arguably highest in vehicles as well. In a driving environment, latency is kind of the enemy of safety. The old assistant was incredibly fast at executing local commands like call your mother or navigate home. Gemini, though, with its cloud-based reasoning, sometimes pauses to think, which can feel like an eternity when you're traveling at 70 miles an hour down a highway or a motorway. Google's challenge here is to kind of bridge that gap between what the assistant was capable of with its speed and Gemini's actual intelligence without compromising you, the driver focus. And yeah, I've experienced this with this transition myself. It is worth noting that all of your existing devices will continue to work with the assistant, but likely with a more limited capacity, or in the case of Google's own first-party hardware, like the Nest speaker and smart display lineups, slowly transition over to Gemini instead of using the assistant if they are still supported. The upcoming updated Google Home speaker, which is due sometime soon, will actually put Gemini much more front and center, and while it isn't here yet, it will give us a way to see what the next generation of smart assistant hardware powered by Gemini will offer over the long-forgotten Nest lineup. This new hardware, though, does represent more of a hard reset for the Google Home and by extension the Nest brand, and therefore the assistant itself. Future devices won't just listen for triggers, they're probably going to be using more multimodal capabilities to see and sense our presence and offer more proactive help rather than help waiting for a command or a voice note. This raises some extra privacy questions that we're not going to go deeply into this video, but it was something that the older, simpler assistant never really had to answer. It is one thing to listen, which is a privacy concern of its own. It's another to listen and make decisions without your user input. So yeah, just how that plays out is going to be interesting to see. Will it be better to just control your lights and some other smart home hardware? Well, that itself does remain to be seen, but there is no future in which we simply go back to simple switch controllers, or at least that's what it seems from here. In one of the most obvious plays in the history of technology, the future is naturally going to be Gemini for Google. This has kind of felt like a decade-long transition in the making. A bigger question is whether a smarter assistant is actually really necessary for doing the kind of things that we've all come to rely on the Google Assistant for. Gemini is built for macro reasoning and complex conversations, and we're trading a dependable utility for a brilliant but sometimes frustrating system. As the assistant starts to fade, so does the era of technology that just worked without necessarily needing a discussion first to get things done. Annoyingly, Google has kind of left the assistant to languish a little as Gemini does loom further. There are times when you can kind of see this with services like the Google Home service, an application that has gained vastly more powerful levels of capabilities with this AI integration. But that said, the assistant was a no-fuss operator. When it works, it's simple, it just triggers to control your smart home, and it's to the point, functional, and that's all it needs to be. Gemini is better at rolling with punches. It's hard not to deny that. It can adjust to circumstances and handle rogue inputs. You can use natural language to talk to Gemini like, well, a human, like me or you. I think this is what Google always wanted from the assistant from the get-go, and many of us probably did without really thinking about it. The sad, slow death spiral of the assistant, though, does pave way for something more all-encompassing, one that is going to be more integrated, able to pick up threads, get updated regularly, and ultimately is going to probably be a better option in the long term. I want to ask you, though, are you sad, are you disappointed, are you frustrated, or are you asking questions like we are about what is happening with the Google Assistant in the long term? Really intrigued to hear what you say. I'm a smart home person myself, and I use a lot of Google Assistant features. So yeah, let me know what you think down in the comment sections below and your questions, and we'll try our best to answer as many as possible. But thanks for watching, and hopefully that's explained some things for you, and I'll speak to you later.